before I introduce Mr. Dolin, I did just want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Foundation for sponsoring tonight's author visit and sponsoring all our virtual and in-person author visits this summer. This is our, I believe, 5th in-person author visit in about 2.5 years. So we're slowly building the in-person attendance back up, and definitely couldn't have done tonight without the Corning Foundation. So we thank them for their generosity. All right, so, and I will dim the lights right after I introduce you here. So tonight we're here for Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution with Eric Jay Dolin. And let me tell you a little bit about Eric. I'm sure most of you know. Author Eric Jay Dolin is the author of 15 books, including Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America, which was chosen as one of the best nonfiction books of 2007 by the LA Times and the Boston Globe. And it also won the 2007 John Lyman Award for U.S. Maritime History. Now we're going to fast forward. His most recent book, Before Rebels at Sea, his most recent book, Before Rebels at Sea, is A Furious Sky, The 500-Year History of America's Hurricanes, which was a finalist for the Kirkus Prize and was chosen as one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post, Booklist, Library Journal, and the editors at Amazon. That book was also selected as a must-read by the Massachusetts Center for the Book back in 2020. A graduate of Brown, Yale, and MIT, so let there be no doubt who the smartest person in the room is, he received his PhD in environmental policy, and he lives in Marblehead with his family. So all of us, let's give a big round of applause to Eric for joining us tonight. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to all of you. Despite what Robert said, there are actually 55 people in the audience. But anyway, thanks for inviting me back. I think this is the 3rd or 4th time I've spoken here. And right before I went upstairs, and I got a great shot. Is that feedback? I got a great shot. In the future, you should have everybody that speaks here go upstairs, and if you stand in the right position, you can take a picture of the cover of your book, and it looks as if that kid is reading your book. So I thought that was kind of cool. Anyway. It was late in the day on June 3rd of 1780 when Salem Captain Jonathan Harridan and his privateer, the Pickering, were heading to the friendly port of Bilbao, Spain, which was an ally at the time, Spain was. The British privateer Achilles, however, stood in the way. Nobody would have faulted Harridan if he had fled in the face of his superior foe. While the Pickering had a crew of 38 men and 16 cannons, the Achilles bristled with 130 men and 43 cannons. Hardly a fair fight, but that's not how Harridan saw it. He relished the chance to confront the enemy and strike a blow for the revolutionary cause. Turning to the British prisoner who had informed him of the Achilles' might, Harridan calmly said, "I shan't run from her," and he didn't. As the Achilles began its advance, Harridan told his men that though the Achilles appeared to be superior to them in force, he had no doubt that he should beat her off if they were firm and steady and did not throw away their fire. Meanwhile, in Bilbao, which was a rather large port, word was spreading that there was going to be an epic battle offshore, and about 1,000 people went down to the beach to watch the spectacle. Booming broadsides and musket fire filled the air. One of Harridan's crew said, while the shot flew around him, Harridan was as calm and steady as amidst a shower of snowflakes. The battle raged for more than 2 hours. Then Harridan ordered his men to put bar shot into the cannons, which is basically 2 cannonballs connected by an iron rod. And when that exits a cannon, it spins wildly and it can shred rigging and sails or even damage a mast or a spar. These projectiles caused a lot of problems for the Achilles, and the Achilles finally had enough. It turned and fled, and despite its injuries, it was still faster than the Pickering and got away. In the meantime, Harridan spun about. He recaptured the Golden Eagle, which was a British ship that he had captured earlier, but the Achilles had taken back. All told, one of Pickering's crew had been killed and his head sheared off by a cannonball, and another 8 men were wounded. Now, this plaque, I'd like to tell you a little story about this plaque that's not in the book. This is the top third of a plaque that I read about while doing research on the book. And it said that it was in Salem, Massachusetts, which is right next to Marblehead, Massachusetts, which is where I live. And this is during COVID, so it said it was right near the Witch House. So I hopped on my bike and I rode over to Salem, and I looked at all the houses in that four-corner area, and I couldn't find this plaque. I did find a couple of other historic plaques, which were quite interesting. So when I got back home, I was a little frustrated. I called a local historian, and I said, "What's up?" And she goes, "Well, you're going to find this funny where the plaque is." I said, "Well, where is it?" It was in a Korean barbecue restaurant right down the street. Nobody has any idea how it ended up there, but I wanted to see it. So I hopped back on my bike and went over to the restaurant. I walk in. The woman was very excited because this was COVID, and she had no customers, and she thought I was there to order some food. I said, "Sorry, I'm not here for any food. I'm here to take a look at that plaque behind your head." And right on the wall is this plaque, which was originally placed in Salem in 1909. And to me, it is emblematic of the way that people have treated privateering in history books since the American Revolution. Sort of tuck it away, not necessarily in the Korean barbecue restaurant, but in the hidden recesses of American history. Now, Harridan remained in Bilbao for 2 months before heading back to Salem. And on the return voyage, true to form, Harridan captured 3 more British prizes, which were sent into Salem. And when he returned, the owners of the Pickering honored their intrepid captain with this beautifully engraved tankard and 2 identical mugs that have the image of the Pickering and his initials. This tankard and those 2 mugs are in the possession of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. And I got in a little bit of trouble about a month and a half ago. I was giving a talk at the Museum of Old Newburyport. My wife was in the audience because a close friend of ours is the director there. And my wife only comes to one of my talks every time I have a book, unless it's on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which is where I spoke in the last 3 weeks. And she came to both of those talks as well. But she was in the audience, and I mentioned that she and I got married at the Peabody Essex Museum, which is true. We were, I think, the first wedding ever held there. And I couldn't remember the year. I said, was it 1995 or 6? That didn't go over very well with my wife. But anyway, during his tenure in the Massachusetts Navy and as a privateer, Harridan took many prizes and brought back hundreds of British cannons and at least as many prisoners. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 59 in 1803, and his obituary in the Salem Gazette lauded him as one of the most able and valiant commanders that the war had produced, and I would agree. Now, the Pickering was one of nearly 2,000 American privateers, and Harridan was one of tens of thousands of privateersmen who served on those vessels during the Revolution. Privateers were armed vessels owned and outfitted by private individuals who had government permission to capture enemy ships during times of war. That permission came in the form of a letter of marque, a formal legal document that gave the bearer the right to attack, seize vessels belonging to belligerent nations, and claim those vessels as the spoils of war. The proceeds from the auction of these prizes was in turn split between the men who fought on the privateer and the owner and investors in the ship. Now, despite the contributions made by Harridan and thousands of other privateersmen, many believe that privateering was a sideshow during the war. Privateering has long been given short shrift in histories of the conflict, not just general histories, but also histories of the Maritime Revolution. Rebels at Sea fills the void by offering a comprehensive account of privateering that demonstrates that it was critical to winning the war. American privateersmen took the fight to the British and made them bleed. In countless daring actions against British merchant ships and not a few warships, privateers caused British maritime insurance rates to rise, diverted critical British resources to protecting their vessels and to attacking privateers, added to British weariness over the war, and played a starring role in bringing France into the war on the side of the Americans, a turning point in the conflict. On the domestic front, privateers brought much-needed goods and military supplies into the new nation, provided cash infusions for the war effort, boosted coastal economies through the building, outfitting, and manning of privateers, and bolstered Americans' confidence that it might actually win this quixotic battle against the greatest power and military force of the day. Now, thousands of books have approached the revolution from virtually every possible angle. Rebels at Sea places privateersmen, most of whom were not famous or even well-known individuals, at the very center of the war effort. It demonstrates that when the United States was only a tenuous idea, they stepped forward and risked their lives to help make it a reality. Now, during the American Revolution, there were 4 maritime forces that fought on behalf of the Americans. There were state navies, Washington's secret navy, which only operated about a year after the beginning of the conflict, the Continental Navy, and privateers. Of these 4, privateers were by far the most numerous and the most effective, capturing somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 to 1,800 British prizes worth many millions of pounds. Now, Massachusetts, my home state now, although I was born in New York, and a place where there were many firsts on tap during the American Revolution, there can be another one added in the realm of privateering. Massachusetts was the first colony to proceed with privateering. On November 1st of 1775, they passed the Massachusetts Privateering Act, and that helped to unleash privateering in the broader colonies. And the value of this act became even clearer in hindsight. Some 40 years later, John Adams would write that the passage of the Massachusetts Act is one of the most important documents in history. The Declaration of Independence is a trifle in comparison with it. And I would agree, during the Revolution, I think that's true. The Declaration of Independence was important, but it was the Massachusetts Privateering Act that sort of started the wave of privateering, which probably had a bigger impact. Since then, I think the Declaration of Independence might be a little bit more important than the Massachusetts Privateering Act. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that David McCullough died, I think it was today or yesterday, and one of my favorite books is his book on John Adams, an overlooked founding father. Now, New Hampshire and Rhode Island followed suit in early 1776 with their own privateering statutes. At the same time, pressure was growing for the Continental Congress to initiate privateering on a colony-wide basis, and they complied on March 23rd of 1776 when Congress passed the Privateering Resolution into law. With their capital tied up at the docks, ship owners eagerly pursued privateering. The prizes that were brought in not only gave them ships and cargo to sell, but also kept their ships operating and in good form. Many men invested in privateers. Indeed, privateering created a speculative frenzy that ran across the colonies, sort of like the Bitcoin frenzy in the country today. Among the more illustrious speculators was General George Washington, who invested in at least one privateer, appropriately enough, called the General Washington. And if he knew that, he must have been mortified, because publicly he didn't like any attention or adulation. Privately, however, I think he loved it. Generals Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox, as well as Paul Revere, also invested in privateering ventures. Now, privateering captains like Elias Davis Sr. here from Gloucester would usually be known to the merchant owners and be hired directly and would be given the greatest share of the prizes. And I want to give you a story about this picture, this young gentleman. As I said, he's out of Gloucester. If you ever go to the Cape Ann Museum, there is an historic house that's attached to the Cape Ann Museum, and as part of it, it is the Elias Davis House. And if you go into it over the mantelpiece, you will see this painting. I was writing this book during COVID when we were all locked down. My daughter, who is now a literary agent in New York, was home. My son, who was at Northeastern, was home. My wife, who worked in Andover at the time, was home. So we had a full house. And I remember coming across this picture. So I called my daughter in, who was single and still is. She was single at the time and 22 years old. And I said, Lily, take a look at this guy. This guy's a privateer. And she took a good long look at this painting and she said, you know, Dad, I could get into privateering. So, a very good looking guy. Now, while crewmen were sometimes known by the owners prior to being hired, in most cases they were not. And they had to be found by using advertisements such as these, which would be placed in local newspapers, encouraging men to sign on for a cruise and offering something which was typically called the hearty welcome. Basically, the men were invited down to the local pub, they were given a lot of liquor, and then they signed the articles of agreement for the cruise. Now, black men served on many privateers. Some were freemen. One of those was Philadelphian James Fortin, who's shown here. At age 14, he signed on to the Pennsylvania privateer, the Royal Lewis. Now, Fortin's job was to bring gunpowder from the ship's magazine to the cannons. The cruise was a triumph. They captured 7 prizes, although Fortin nearly got killed because a couple of cannonballs came careening through the side of the Royal Lewis to the cannon station that he was providing gunpowder to, and 3 men were killed. He survived. He came home, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but James Fortin was one of the few, relatively few, free black individuals in Philadelphia. His family, his mother and father, were also free. And he gave some of his money to his mother and father, and he decided to sign up for a second cruise with the Royal Lewis. In hindsight, he shouldn't have been so rash. The Royal Lewis was just out of port only a day when the HMS Amphion, a large British warship, captured it. Now, Fortin was terrified, because as he later wrote, men of his complexion, in other words, black men who were captured by British ships, were generally sent to the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and sold into slavery. And he thought that was going to be his fate. But fortunately for him, the captain of the HMS Amphion, a guy named John Baisley, decided to tap Fortin to be a companion to his 12-year-old son, who was also on the ship. And during the next 4 to 5 weeks, Fortin and Baisley's son got along very well. So when the HMS Amphion pulled into New York City, ready to deposit all the men on board the Royal Lewis on the Jersey prison ship, which was docked in New York City, and I'll talk about later, most people that went into the Jersey prison ship never made it out alive. Baisley said to Fortin, I'm going to give you a deal, or I'll give you 2 options. One is you can be the ward of my son. I could send you back to England. You'll be free. You'll be educated. You'll have money. You'll have a great life. Or you are going to go with the rest of the men on the Royal Lewis to the Jersey prison ship. James Fortin, who considered himself a patriot and hoped that one day his new nation would live up to the ringing words of the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal, decided that he was going to stick with his men. And he lasted on the Jersey for 8 months before being traded in a prisoner exchange. And after the war, he fought very hard to make his new nation live up to the Declaration of Independence's words. Now, he wasn't successful during his life, but he was very successful in his own life. When he died in 1842, he was worth $70,000. He was the premier sailmaker in Philadelphia, and he worked continuously for the rights of his fellow black citizens. And one of the most important things he did is he loaned his friend, William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, the seed money he needed to start The Liberator, which was the #1 anti-slavery publication leading up to the Civil War. So he did have a major impact ultimately on the issue that he felt so passionately about. Now, other men, black men on these privateers, were enslaved individuals. Some had run away from their owners to obtain their freedom. Other owners, sometimes owners, would rent out enslaved individuals as a money-making scheme. Now, this painting is fascinating. This painting was owned by a urologist in Rhode Island. That's not what's fascinating. But it was thought to be the only known painting of a black privateersman during the American Revolution. And as such, it was considered very valuable. In fact, it was estimated to be worth $300,000. And it was used in many books about the American Revolution as an example of a black man that fought on the side of the patriot cause. Fraunces Tavern in New York City was going to use this painting as a centerpiece in its exhibition about black individuals' participation in the Revolution. So the urologist said, I've got to send this painting out to get spiffed up a little bit. He sent it to a local art conservator. The art conservator took a little bit of solvent, started rubbing the hand. Off came the black paint, revealing a white hand beneath. It turns out that somebody in the mid-20th century who realized that a painting of a black privateersman would be worth far more than a contemporary painting of a white American mariner, doctored the painting. And he was right, because after it was discovered that it was a fake, its value plummeted to $3,000, and Fraunces Tavern, understandably, backed out of using it as the centerpiece of their exhibition. But it went back to the urologist's house, where it hung in the living room, and the urologist's son is a friend of mine. I know. So anyway, and then there were those black men who were treated as transient property. When privateers captured British slavers off the west coast of Africa, which was done quite often, they didn't emancipate the black cargo. They brought it to slave auctions in the colonies or in the Caribbean, in effect turning privateers into slave traders. Now, many have argued that privateersmen were motivated more by greed than patriotism. Famed naval officer John Paul Jones, shown here, thought it was nothing but greed. A less cynical assessment views privateersmen as being motivated by a combination of profits and patriotism, and this view is closer to the truth. Now, part of the reason why privateering was scorned at the time was that many believed that the practice undermined the Republican ideals of the Revolution, which called for the sacrifice of private interests in the pursuit of liberty. According to Mercy Otis Warren, shown here, who wrote one of the first books on the American Revolution, not using a pen name, but using her own name, she said that privateering had a tendency to contract the mind and led it to shrink into selfish views and indulgencies, totally inconsistent with genuine republicanism. Many of the founding fathers and mothers and other elites would have agreed in theory. But in practice, however, many elites had a more complex view of patriotism that wasn't based on hewing to Republican ideals above all else. The majority of the delegates to Congress clearly believed that privateering was a patriotic endeavor that served the public good. They made it a cornerstone of the American war effort, realizing that it made some people rich, including many of them. Had Congress deemed that privateering worked against the public good, or that it wasn't a net benefit to the war effort, they could have stopped this practice at any time, but they never entertained that thought. That's because the delegates and many other political and civic leaders didn't view patriotism and the pursuit of profit as mutually exclusive. Now, the argument that privateers were only in it for money implies that others weren't. That is not true. While the men who rose up after the Battle of Bunker Hill were burning with patriotic fervor, that fire was difficult to maintain for many soldiers in the later years of the war. The only way that Congress could keep some semblance of a strong fighting force was to use cash bonuses and the promises of land to induce men to serve. The Navy was no different. Those who served in the Continental Navy and state navies and Washington's Navy got paid, and they also got a cut of the profits of any prize they captured. They wouldn't have stepped forward and served if there wasn't the prospect of earning some money. This recruiting poster, which was put together by none other than John Paul Jones, was plastered all over Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It could have just as easily been a recruiting poster for a privateer, because there's a sentence in it that says it would give the men that step forward the opportunity to distinguish themselves in the glorious cause of their country and to make their fortunes. The perspective of most privateersmen is best reflected in the comments of privateersman and soldier Christopher Prince, who said, looking back on his revolutionary career, "Through the whole course of the war, I have had two motives in view. One was the freedom of my country, and the other was the luxuries of life." Now, privateers experienced many triumphs and tragedies during the war. One of the most successful privateers was the brig Holker out of Philadelphia. On a single cruise, it captured 10 ships that, when brought into port, were sold for £2 million. Now, whenever I write a book, it's almost always about a topic I don't know a lot about, and that was the case with privateering. And this expedition, which I'm going to talk about, the Penobscot expedition, was one of the biggest surprises to me in the book. And it is one of the worst tragedies to befall American privateers. The Penobscot expedition was the largest American maritime force assembled during the Revolution. It consisted of 19 warships, 12 of which were privateers. Their mission was to dislodge British forces which were building a fort, Fort George, on a peninsula in Maine's Penobscot Bay, present-day Castine. The expedition sailed from Boston on July 19, 1779, but it was a total fiasco. Poor organization and leadership and a critical delay in launching the attack really caused problems when on August 14th, the Royal Navy showed up at the mouth of the Penobscot Bay. It was a complete rout. In the end, 16 American ships were burned by their own men to keep them from falling into the hands of the enemy, and the rest were captured or sunk. As for the men, they bolted into the woods and tried desperately to make it back to Massachusetts and New Hampshire before starving. How many Americans died during this siege and rout is not known with any exactitude. Estimates range from about 30 people to a high of nearly 500, and I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. And what's most interesting to me is many have labeled this the most devastating naval defeat that the United States suffered up until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. And if I remember correctly, aren't you having William Martin next week talk about his new book, 1941? Anyway, one of the most important things that privateers did during the Revolution was to help bring France into the American side. France, in the early years of the war, France allowed American privateers in the Caribbean and in France to use their ports, reprovision, and take on new men. All of this was in violation of treaties between France and Great Britain. That, plus the damage done by the privateers, infuriated the British. The Continental Congress sent William Bingham to the French colony of Martinique, where a large part of his job was to extend American privateering efforts. It worked brilliantly. In 1778, it was estimated that American privateers had captured roughly 250 British ships, trading ships in the area, and that the volume of British trade had fallen by 66%. So alarming were these figures that the Earl of Suffolk urged Parliament to keep them from the public, pointing out the impropriety of acknowledging what ought not to be acknowledged at so critical a period, the weakness of the nation. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin, who was in France to negotiate a formal alliance, was convinced that privateering was helping the American cause with the French while at the same time injuring Britain. That which makes the greatest impression in our favor here, Franklin wrote, is the prodigious success of our armed ships and privateers. London's Public Advertiser asserted that if France continued to allow American privateers to sail from French ports, an immediate war between France and this country will be the inevitable consequence. Now, the critical turning point in getting France to ally with the Americans was the American victory over British General John Burgoyne's army at Saratoga on October 17, 1777. Privateering, while not causing a sharp turn in American fortunes on its own, helped create the situation in which this great American victory could prove decisive in bringing France into the conflict. And it did so by greatly increasing the enmity between France and Britain, and also inflicting serious damage on the British economy. Now, one of the worst chapters, and I think arguably the worst chapter in the American Revolution, concerned the British prisons in England and in New York. In both places, American privateersmen made up the bulk of the prison population. The two main prisons in Britain were called Mill and Fortin Prison, and together they held roughly 3,000 men during the war, and they had death rates of between 3 to 6%, which was on par with other prisons during this era. Now, Mill and Fortin prisons were bad enough, but by far the worst experience any combatant had to endure was a stay on one of the British prison ships moored off New York City. Between 15,000 and 22,000 men were held on these ships. All of the ships were dreadful, but the Jersey was by far the worst. Nicknamed Hell Afloat, the Jersey had been a fourth-rate 64-gun British warship. It was the largest of the British prison ships, and it held at any one time between 850 and 1,200 prisoners. Between 6 and 12 men died per day on the Jersey. Every morning, as the sun rose, the guards would yell, "Rebels, bring up your dead." One inmate left the following damning portrait of his time on the Jersey. There were about 1,100 prisoners on board. There were no berths or seats. Many were almost without clothes. The dysentery, fever, frenzy, and despair prevailed among them and filled the place with filth, disgust, and horror. The scantiness of the allowance, the bad quality of the provisions, the brutality of the guards, and the sick pining for comforts they could not obtain, altogether furnished continually one of the greatest scenes of human distress and misery ever beheld. The number of deaths on the Jersey alone is shocking. The best estimates point to it being roughly 11,500, the vast majority of which were American privateers. By comparison, in the entire war, somewhere between 4,400 and 6,600 Americans died in the direct line of battle. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of privateers is that they drained men and munitions and guns from the Continental Navy and Army, and that's absolutely true. Many men chose to go on to the Continental Navy because they thought they could earn more money, but that doesn't mean, had there been no privateers, that the Continental Navy would have suddenly been transformed into a fearsome fighting force. There were roughly 60 Continental Navy ships during the war in the Atlantic. Building and assembling a navy from scratch would have been a gargantuan task for a well-functioning, well-funded government. The Continental Congress was anything but. They couldn't levy taxes, and they had a tough time coming up with the $16 to $24 million it cost to put together this navy, and they had a really difficult time getting all 13 colonies to row literally in the same direction. So it was almost an insurmountable challenge. The Continental Navy's record in battle is dismal. 28 vessels were captured or destroyed, and many others were lost at sea, sold, returned to France, or burned to keep them from being taken by the enemy. At war's end, there were just a few Continental Navy ships left. However, there were a few bright spots for the Continental Navy. Raids on Caribbean munitions depots brought back much-needed gunpowder. Navy ships did an excellent job of ferrying diplomats and dispatches across the Atlantic, and they captured roughly 200 prizes. Nevertheless, in 1780, John Adams reflected on the fortunes of the Continental Navy, writing, "In looking over the long list of vessels belonging to the United States taken and destroyed, and recollecting the whole history of the rise and progress of our Navy, it is very difficult to avoid tears. The American Revolution was the Navy's first hour, but not its finest. If there had been no privateers, the Navy would have had an easier time recruiting officers and sailors and obtaining cannons and ammunition. But the absence of privateers would not have meant a larger or significantly more effective Navy. Congress would not have suddenly had the money and materials to produce such a force. While many would have preferred that America send forth a powerful Navy, that was not a realistic option. In the absence of such a force, America relied heavily on its privateers. Under the circumstances, that was the best strategy available. On the home front, privateers contributed materially to the American economy. Privateering was a great economic boom for coastal towns and cities, keeping many businesses afloat during the war and creating new ones, as well as new fortunes. And the money that privateersmen earned helped them support their families and gave an additional jolt to local economies. Each prize auction delivered a new stream of commodities into the colonies. In August of 1779, a thankful Pennsylvanian told Congress that privateers have rendered us the most essential services and brought us many articles for public and private use, without which the war could hardly have been supported. Privateering also had a psychological effect on the home front. There were about 30 newspapers in the colonies during the American Revolution. They had thousands of articles on privateering. And those articles, some of them were negative, but many were positive or neutral. And in the first years of the conflict, when things looked worse for the Americans, the stories about privateers and their successes gave Americans some confidence that maybe we were going to win this war. Now, the formal end of the war came on September 3rd of 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed. Surviving privateers that had been merchantmen before the war now reverted to form, while those vessels built for privateering were refitted as merchantmen. These ships now played their part in transporting America's wares to distant ports, proudly flying the new nation's flag. The men who owned and financed privateers, as well as the men who fought for their country on the decks of these vessels, looked back on their accomplishments with pride and wondered, as did all Americans, what the future would bring for themselves and their new country. And with that, I am done. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I will add one thing that was interesting in writing this book. Well, a lot of things that were interesting, but one of them is I wrote a book earlier called When America First Met China about the China trade. And there were a lot of vessels in that book. And when I was working on this book, I suddenly realized that a lot of privateers during the American Revolution, once the war ended, they were the vanguard of our merchant shipping that went to far-flung ports, including Canton, China, to start our China trade. So I thought it was a fascinating connection that I was unaware of before I started working on the book. But thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that there might be. Yes?
And 1 second, sir.
Oh.
I'm going to give you the microphone so the audience at home can hear you.
Oh.
Were the majority of privateers independently financed or without any support? It would seem like a very questionable act to take on the British without any guarantee they were going to come out of this thing, even with their ship.
Right, well, there are two ways to look at it. They were very well financed because all the ships were provided by merchants, many of whom had deep pockets. And Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, also invested in a number of privateers, and he made a very insightful comment. He said, you need to keep sending out ships, just keep doing it, and one success can make up for 3 or 4 losses. So merchants who had deep pockets and their investors who were hoping to get a hit, they were willing to accept some losses as long as occasionally there was a big win, and there were enough wins to offset the losses for many of the merchants. Not all of them. Some merchants went bankrupt, losing their ships, but a number of merchants did well. And then if you go down to the individuals who fought on the vessels, well, a lot of them had a horrible outcome. They were captured by the British, and they ended up going to prison ships. But those who didn't, there were many privateersmen who came home, the captains of ships and the men on board, who may have a payday of 5,000 pounds down to 1,000 pounds, which for an average sailor of the time, 1,000 pounds was many, many years, decades of productive work. And 5,000 pounds, which is what some captains of these ships often earned, was basically what a well-heeled merchant of the time would have in their 401k, would have in their back pocket. So it was really like gambling because there were major losses. You could lose your life, you could lose your livelihood, but there were enough successes to keep privateering going throughout the American Revolution. And one of the owners, main owners, a guy named Blair McClanahan out of Philadelphia, was called the millionaire maker. He's the guy who owned the Holker because so many of his ships did very well, and some of the men who sailed under him became quite wealthy. But it's a tough way to make a living. Hey, it's much easier to be a writer than to be a privateer.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, sure.
So anyone else in the in-person audience have a question for Eric? Yes. And by the way, I hope you don't mind me saying this. This is a very popular speaker on the library circuit right here. I believe Chris has spoken here at least a couple of times, but he knows his history. So let's see what he has to say.
Thanks, Robert. Talking about your description of privateering sort of reminded me about book publishing business too. Nine losses to make up for the one hit that they get.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about the research process that went into this, where you found the sources, and you had mentioned that you were doing this during COVID. I know a lot of archives shuttered their doors for quite a long time afterwards, and I was just wondering how that impacted how you had to do the research for the book, and maybe how you had to get a little creative to...
No, it did. It definitely impacted it. Well, the way that I researched it, first I go to any books that broadly talk about privateering. There weren't a whole lot. I read a bunch of books about the American Revolution that had small sections on privateering. I started to get an overall sense of where I wanted to go. Then I went to the Journals of the Continental Congress, the Journals of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, to get a real sense of how the privateering laws were developed and what was the debate about. And then there were numerous newspapers that had a lot of articles about privateering. I combed all of those, pulled out anything that I could use for a narrative. There were other books that were written right after the American Revolution that had snippets about privateering. There were about 5 or 6 men who survived their stay on the Jersey prison ship who wrote their memoirs. So not only could I get insights into what it was like to be in that prison ship, they also wrote about their time leading up to their imprisonment. So I got a little bit about their privateering lives. There were a few other memoirs written by privateersmen, not as many as I would have liked. So through all those sources, I was able to build a narrative arc. There are a number of secondary sources I used as well to fill in this broader story of the American Revolution and how it was interacting with privateering. There are, pension records. I mean, there were a lot of sources, disparate sources, that I was able to draw upon. But what's more interesting to me, that's the same process I go through for every book. And really what it is, it's a process of deciding what you can leave out, because there's always more information that I gather that I can include in a book, because I don't want the book to be too long and I want it to move quickly. So that's the process of gathering the information. But the second part of your question is more interesting. I signed the contract for this book about a month and a half before the national lockdown for COVID in March of 2020, if I remember correctly. Sorry, I'm itching my eyes because allergy is really bad. Anyway, I signed the book contract. I didn't know the national lockdown was coming, but luckily, I do a lot of my research at Harvard's Widener Library, one of the greatest libraries in the world. They have access to almost every single database, 18th century newspapers, early American newspapers, British newspapers. They also have millions of books, a lot of books in the Houghton Rare Book Library collection, in the Widener collection. And I spend a lot of time at Widener Library basically scanning or downloading documents that I use to build my narrative. For whatever reason, and I can't tell you exactly why I decided to do it at that moment, just natural part of research, I went in and for 2 straight days, I remember before I went in, I ordered over 100 books to be put on hold for me. I went in for 2 days from 9 in the morning till, actually it was past 5 because the semester was on, and I basically downloaded documents, newspapers, Boston Post, whatever, and I used this big scanner, the flatbed scanner, to scan dozens of books, chapters, old books, out-of-print books. I came home with a stick, a USB stick, that I would guarantee had more than 200, maybe even more than 300 individual documents on it, or pieces. And then 4 days later, the entire country locked down, Widener closed, I had no more access to any library. If I hadn't done that, I'm not sure I could have written the book, and I certainly couldn't have written the book that I did. But one other thing, I have to give one other shout out. I realized that I still needed to look at a lot of original newspapers from the American Revolution. And there wasn't a single library open that had that subscription to early American newspapers that I could go use. So I contacted the company that sells that subscription service to libraries. I asked if I could buy an individual membership just for a short period of time. No. I said, well, can you let me just use it for a week? All I need is a week. No. Well, I wouldn't give up. I kept asking. I finally got to a vice president in the company. I got on the phone. I told her who I was. I said, this is what I'm doing. Please. And she said, okay. And she sent me a special code. And I was allowed to have access from my computer in my house to early American newspapers, as you are very familiar with, I'm sure. And I could, for 2 weeks, I could search to my heart's delight. And I used every keyword I could think of to get these documents. And I downloaded scores, if not hundreds of more articles that helped me flesh out the narrative. So COVID really threw a loop in my life, in my writing life, but it had one real positive impact. I wrote this book in about 14 months. It usually takes me 18 months to 20 months or sometimes 24 months to research and write a book. I was home all the time. And my coworkers, my wife, my son and daughter didn't want to talk to me during the day. They really they weren't very good coworkers because I like goofing around a lot during the day. Even though I'm alone, I call people, I do this. I like to take breaks. They were very serious. So I was basically in my little office, the door closed, working all day long. And our family got in the habit of having dinner at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. So I wake up early, so I'd be in my office at 7:30 in the morning, and I'd be working there till 8 o'clock at night, till dinner time. So I got a lot of work done. But I would rather not have COVID.
So Eric, we have a pretty vibrant writing group that meets here at the library. We're actually meeting virtually at the moment. We meet the last Monday of every month for those in the audience who may be aspiring writers at 7 o'clock. But I'm just wondering, what's sort of the best piece of writing advice you can give to an aspiring writer?
Embrace failure. I have met so many people over the years who want to be writers. And I would say the number one impediment, despite in some cases a lack of talent, you need some talent, but you really need drive almost more than talent. But the number one thing that I've gotten from these conversations, these coffee conversations, is that people fear rejection and failure. I've written 15 books. I've had tons of failures, and I remember my first book with a major publisher, Leviathan, my agent, it was hard getting an agent. There was many years I didn't have an agent. My agent sent it out to 25 publishers. 22 of them said, no, we're not interested. Nobody's interested in a book on whaling. It's too broad of a topic. 3 of them were ultimately interested, and I went with Norton, and the book did very well. So those other 22, they're all wrong. But in my other books, nobody in publishing knows exactly what's going to happen. There are books people think are sure hits that don't do well, books that are sleepers that do well. But getting back to writing, the biggest thing you need, I think, to be a successful writer is the passion to do the writing, the willingness to sit down and write. You don't have to write every day. I don't believe that. Writers are always saying you have to write every day. Baloney. There are times when I go for a week or two, I don't write a darn thing. Or I go for months where I'm researching, where I don't write anything. I'm just taking notes. And then there are some days where I have an amazing day and I write 4,000 words, which is a lot. David McCullough used to say 400 words was a good day for him. There are other days where I write many fewer words than that. But the most difficult thing, and I think the best characteristic that a writer can have, is not giving up. If this is what they really want to do, they're going to have to fight. And it is not always the best writers that are the successes. And it's a combination of timing, topic, and other intangibles, and it's not a fair system. Publishing is very difficult. Chris knows a lot about this, but I've known a lot of writers over the years that I've met, and I can give you examples of writers who have had a big hit, and then the next 4 books do horribly, and now they're self-publishing their books because they couldn't get a big publisher anymore. I know people who have had hit after hit, and they're just lucky. And then I've known people that write beautiful, wonderful books. They sell 1,000 copies. I have a friend who will remain nameless who is a much better writer than I am, has a great idea, had a book out sent out to publishers. Nobody has bitten on it. I have no idea why. It's a great idea, great book, wonderful writer. So persistence. What did Edison say? 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. The one trait that I have that has kept me going, 2 traits. One is I'm neurotic. 2 is I'm driven. I wake up, I work. I've never had writer's block. I don't believe in it. If you're meant to write, you write. If you're somebody who can't write for 3 months because you're scared of something, you shouldn't be a writer. Do something else. Not everybody should be a writer. Writing is just like any other job. So if you have an aptitude for it and you're willing to push ahead and you're willing to accept rejection and not be so crumbled by it that you can't wake up the next day and start working again, that's what I would do. I think at the risk of saying too much maybe, a lot of writers, and not so much nonfiction, I've known some fiction writers too, but a lot of writers, a lot of people elevate writing to this almost spiritual activity that, because people envy writers, people want to be writers. That is very common. In England, they had a big survey 4 years ago, and the number one career choice for people in England was to be a writer. People have this image of writing. Oh, I can wear a beret, and I can drink coffee all day, and I can write a book, and it'll sell well, and blah, blah. Writing is just like any other job. And a lot of the writers that I've met, I would call posers. They have this image of writing as their, it's so important. They have to use big words and blah, blah, blah. It's a job. And you write a technical job, you write something that you would want to read. I write fairly simply. That's because that's the kind of books I like to read. I don't like big flowery sentences that halfway through you're wondering which direction you're going in. So anyway, that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, well, hey, I got a lot out of that question there. Thank you. Good pieces of advice there. Is there anyone else in the room that has a comment or a question for Mr. Dolin?
Just a comment.
Sure.
I don't think writing is like any other job. Walk to any bookstore or library and see the line up the books, just study them, and then you get someone who sells every other book. I would think it'd be the most depressing profession in the world for me.
That's an interesting. Yes, when I go into a bookstore, I have a panic attack because I see all these books. You realize in a bookstore, 90% of those books probably never sell more than 10,000 copies, and it's very hard to make a living as a writer if you're only selling 10,000 copies of your book. Now, just to give you an insight into myself, I do fairly well, but I couldn't be a writer if I didn't have a supportive wife who's always earned more money than me. If I didn't work for many years and saved a lot of money, and we had some good breaks. Plus, in the writing world, I probably do better than 95% of the writers in terms of the money I get. But I'm not a huge mega best-selling writer. I can't go buy a yacht or anything like that. But you're absolutely right. It is depressing for a lot of writers. I know an author who had a front-page review in the New York Times, and her book only ended up selling 7,000 copies. She was devastated. It was a glowing review in the New York Times. So anyway, maybe it's not like any other job in the sense that you're putting something out there for the whole world to see, for critics to review, other people to give you pot shots. Now with social media and Amazon customer reviews, you get a lot of people weighing in on your product. Most people go to their job and they have a small group of people who they interact with, and the rest of the world doesn't know what they're doing. So in that sense, it is very different. And that's another reason why a writer, especially if you become moderately successful, you need to have a thick skin, because no matter what you write, some people are going to hate it, some people are going to mock you, and other people are going to love it. But that's like a lot of things in life. So again, it can be depressing because of the economics of writing. And I will tell you, in my short time in the publishing industry, seriously, since 2007, that's when I became a full-time writer, I have seen a shift. Publishing houses, first there's consolidation. Second of all, publishing houses are spending more of their time and energy on the small percentage of best-selling books at the top, which they should probably, because it's making 90% of their profits. And mid-list authors and lower-list authors are getting much less attention. They don't get marketing, and they don't get shelf space, and it's hard to break out. So yes, it can't. If you're an optimist, you take the positives. If you're a pessimist, there's plenty of downside to publishing. But it's just like being a painter. I don't know if I know some painters. It's just like trying to make a living as a painter or a musician, just as difficult as doing as a writer. So again, just be persistent. But it is a strange profession. In the mechanics of it are quite different. When I used to work for the federal government, I worked for the federal government for many years, different jobs. I worked for nonprofits, and I worked for consulting firms. I worked on Capitol Hill for a senator. All those jobs, I had a paycheck every 2 weeks. I had stability. I never got fired from those jobs. With writing, you have no stability. Your paycheck, if you looked at my earnings in the last 13 years, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this. And it's not a career I'd recommend for my kids, even though my daughter's a literary agent and she wants to be a writer. But she's going into it with eyes wide open. So anyway, why'd you ask that question? See, I'm really passionate about that because I've had this conversation so many times with aspiring writers. Everybody is not Stephen King or David McCullough, but even people that are very successful, sometimes, you think they're an overnight success. They might have toiled away for 10 years making nothing, slinging pizzas at night, trying to write. Everybody's got their own path to success, and everybody's got their own definition of success. And so if you can piece it together and be a writer, great, but it's hard.
No, good insights. We appreciate those. So I got a couple of comments emailed to me saying that they've enjoyed the program, but no substantive questions from anyone watching on YouTube.
Okay.
And we're approaching 8 o'clock, so why don't we wind it down here? So do you have any last words for the audience, Eric?
No, good luck.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I want to thank Eric, Mr. Dolin, for speaking to us this evening. Want to thank the audience in the room most importantly. Also want to thank the folks at home. I neglected to thank Brian from Tewksbury Telemedia for filming this for Local Access TV and for live streaming it on YouTube. And so thank you all so much, and I hope to see you at a future author visit. Thanks so much. Have a good night.